The mist
Blood
clung
and
to the
fire,
towering
smoke
pyramids
and
of
shadow,
the ancient Maya
we
cities,
ascend
curling
to the
around
high
stone steps
temple.
worn smooth by centuries of devotion. Shadows moved in the temple chambers, flickering with torchlight, as if the walls themselves remembered the screams and whispered prayers of those who had come before. Among these shadows, the blood queens walked, women both revered and imprisoned, chosen not for their power in politics or beauty in courts, but for a sacred destiny that bound them in ritualistic terror. They were intermediaries between the mortal and divine, embodiments of cosmic balance. Yet their lives were a paradox of worship and horror. In the eyes of the people, they were holy. In the chambers of the gods, they were prisoners. These queens were not simply ceremonial figures. Their existence was a complex negotiation between devotion, fear, and duty, a psychological tightrope that few could imagine. Every step, they took up the steps of the pyramid. Every thread of ceremonial silk draped over their shoulders carried the weight of generations. They were symbols of life, fertility, and divine favor. Yet their bodies were tools of ritual sacrifice, instruments through which the gods demanded proof of faith. To the Maya, blood was not a symbol of sin, but a conduit of energy, a bridge connecting human fragility to the eternal cosmos. The more horrific the act, the more sacred the outcome. From the outside, their lives may have seemed enviable. Lavish garments, golden jewelry, and a position of unmatched influence marked their presence in the city. But the glamour was only skin deep, a veneer over the psychological torment that came with their sacred calling. The initiation alone was enough to strip away any illusions of freedom. Young girls, sometimes barely entering adulthood, were trained in the ways of ritualistic devotion, taught that self-inflicted pain was a form of purification and that suffering could elevate the soul beyond the earthly plane. The transition from maiden to blood queen was as terrifying as it was transformative, a descent into a world where beauty and cruelty were inseparable. It was not merely physical pain that marked their lives, but a constant psychological tension between fear and faith. These queens were expected to navigate a labyrinth of sacred obligations, each more grotesque than the last, all in service to gods whose demands were inscrutable and absolute. Their bodies became maps of devotion, each cut, bite, or wound a testament to the cosmic hierarchy that governed the universe. And yet, their minds are not entirely enslaved. Within this horror existed a strange form of agency, understanding, perhaps even embracing, the terror as a necessary part of maintaining balance, a grim wisdom passed down from queens before them. The cities themselves seemed to respond to their presence. Markets buzzed below the pyramids, unaware of the secret horrors performed at the summits. The people celebrated the queens, offering reverence and admiration, while remaining ignorant of the nightly ceremonies where boundaries between devotion and degradation blurred. To outsiders, the blood queens were paragons of divine grace. To those who glimpsed the hidden chambers, they were figures of tragic, almost unbearable, human sacrifice. The juxtaposition of public honor and private torment created a tension that was both awe-inspiring and horrifying, a tension that defined every ritual, every whispered prayer, every drop of blood shed in the name of the gods. By the end of the day, as torches guttered and shadows swallowed the stone altars, one could almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down. The blood queens were immortalized in legend, yet their lives were fleeting in reality, measured not by years but by the intensity of their devotion. Their story begins here, at the intersection of beauty and brutality, faith and fear, power and helplessness. It is a story that forces us to confront the extremes of human belief, to peer into a world where the divine demands acts most would consider unspeakable, and to wonder why anyone would willingly walk such a path. And it is in this paradox, the reverence that demanded horror, the devotion that invited suffering, that the true essence of the Blood Queens is revealed. They were not merely victims of faith. They were participants in a cosmic theater where every act, no matter how horrifying, was a piece of a larger, unfathomable design. The audience of history watches in awe and discomfort, unable to look away from the blend of horror and majesty that defined their lives. In the shadowed corridors of Maya temples, amidst the echoes of chants and the scent of incense and blood, the stage is set for a journey into a world that is as psychologically complex as it is terrifying. Here, the line between devotion and cruelty blurs, and the story of the Blood Queens begins. The Maya believed that the gods demanded more than prayers or offerings. They demanded life itself. Blood was the currency of divine favor, and the Blood Queens were the chosen vessels through which the gods could manifest. Their bodies became living altars, and every ritual they performed was a testament to an ideology that fused horror and devotion into a single, unyielding doctrine. To the Maya, the world existed in a precarious balance. The heavens could flourish or collapse based on the proper alignment of ritual, sacrifice, and cosmic obedience. And at the center of this cosmic equation stood the queens, bound by destiny and expectation, forced to perform acts that blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane. The gods themselves were capricious and demanding, representing forces that were beautiful, terrifying, and impossible to fully comprehend. Rain, drought, fertility, and plague were not abstract phenomena, but expressions of divine will, punishments, or rewards delivered according to the precision of ritual. The Blood Queens, as conduits between humanity and divinity, bore the psychological weight of this responsibility. Every cut of a ceremonial knife, every drop of blood offered, was not merely symbolic. It was an act believed to sustain the cosmos itself. The stakes were nothing less than survival, for the people, for the city, and even for the queens themselves. To understand the terror and devotion of these queens, one must first grasp the ideology that made such acts necessary. The Maya did not view bloodletting as cruelty, but as communication. The pain endured was both a language and a gift, a tangible way to connect the mortal with the divine. When a queen pierced her tongue, drew blood from her fingertips, or performed other unspeakable acts, she was not committing transgression. She was honoring a covenant with forces far beyond human comprehension. These rituals were codified in mythology, inscribed in codices, and etched into the walls of temples, giving them a permanence that intertwined duty, fear, and devotion. Yet the psychological burden was immense. To be chosen as a Blood Queen was to inherit a dual identity, one of reverence and one of terror. Publicly, they were honored, adorned in ornate jewelry and ceremonial headdresses that marked their divine role. Privately, they endured rituals that tested their endurance, sanity, and moral resolve. The paradox of this duality, to be worshipped while simultaneously suffering, created a tension that was both sacred and unbearable. These queens lived in a state of constant vigilance, knowing that a single misstep could invoke the gods' wrath, jeopardize the city's fortune, or stain their own sacred legacy. The rituals themselves were meticulously orchestrated, steeped in symbolism, and performed with precision. Every act, from a use of obsidian blades to the selection of ceremonial garments, carried meaning. The blood offered was never random. It was a deliberate act of alignment with celestial forces. The Maya believed that each act could influence rain, fertility, or the trajectory of wars. This imbued every ritual with gravity, and the queens understood that their own suffering was a form of agency, terrifying yet empowering. Their pain was both weapon and offering, a tool through which the divine could speak, a means of negotiating with forces that were indifferent to human morality. In this world, fear and faith were inseparable. The queens internalized the gods' demands in ways that shaped not only their bodies, but their very psychology. The ceremonies required them to confront the extremes of human experience, pain, humiliation, and acts considered taboo, and to reconcile these with the belief that such suffering was holy. The mind became a battlefield as intense as the ceremonial knife, where obedience and dread warred within the consciousness of the chosen. Scholars suggest that this psychological conditioning created resilience, detachment, and a complex form of devotion, allowing the queens to endure rituals that would have broken ordinary mortals. Yet, the power dynamic was never entirely in the queen's favor. Kings, priests, and city elites observed these rituals with awe, ensuring that the sacred performance also reinforced social hierarchies. The blood queens were both exalted and exploited, divinely honored yet humanly constrained. Their suffering was a spectacle that maintained order, legitimized rulers, and reminded the populace of the cosmic consequences of disobedience. In essence, the queens were living bridges between divine will and societal control, embodying both reverence and repression. Contrast was central to the Maya worldview. Light and shadow, life and death, beauty and horror. These were not opposites, but complementary forces. The ceremonial chambers reflected this duality. Gilded altars and painted murals depicted gods of fertility and rain. Yet beneath their splendor lay stone steps slick with blood from countless rituals. The queens moved through these spaces, their graceful movements masking the physical torment endured, the delicate headdresses concealing the wounds beneath. The tension between what was seen and what was suffered created a cinematic theater of faith, one that has haunted the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and storytellers alike. Ultimately, the blood queens were forced to perform these rituals because the Maya believed that the survival of their civilization depended upon it. Every act, no matter how terrifying, was framed as a sacred necessity, a form of communication with powers beyond mortal reckoning. The gods demanded proof of devotion, and the queens were the living conduits for that proof. Their lives illustrate a culture where fear and faith were intertwined, where beauty could not exist without horror, and where the human psyche was pushed to its outermost limits in the name of cosmic balance. As the torches flickered and incense filled the temple chambers, the psychological reality of being a blood queen became apparent. To occupy such a role was to live perpetually on the knife edge of devotion and dread. The city depended on them, the gods commanded them, and history would remember them in whispers and legends. In this intersection of power, terror, and faith, one begins to understand the full scope of what it meant to be a blood queen, a sacred instrument, a political symbol, and a human being trapped in an unholy contract with the divine. The initiation of a Mayan blood queen was not a ceremony. It was a passage into a world where fear, devotion, and the divine collided with brutal intensity. From the moment a young girl was chosen, she was set on a path that transformed her from a maiden into a living conduit of the god's will. This was not merely a social elevation or a political appointment. It was a sacred burden that required complete submission to a ritual life where the boundaries between honor and horror were erased. Every step, every action, and every wound carried symbolic meaning, a testament to the belief that pain was a language through which the mortal could commune with the divine. The initiation began in secrecy, away from the eyes of the common populace. Young girls, often barely reaching adolescence, were led into chambers adorned with symbols of fertility, rain, and celestial power. Incense curled in the dim light, mingling with the scent of blood and earth, creating a sensory environment designed to both awe and terrify. The walls themselves were alive with the mythology of the gods, painted murals depicting legendary sacrifices and acts of devotion. Within these sacred spaces, the initiate was confronted with the reality of her destiny, a life in which beauty and suffering were inseparable, where her body would serve as both altar and instrument of communication with the divine. The psychological conditioning began immediately. Mentors and elder queens instructed the girls in the sacred language of pain. Each cut, each pinprick, each carefully measured self-inflicted wound was explained as an offering, a necessary act to maintain cosmic balance. These rituals were exacting in detail. The flow of blood, the placement of ceremonial instruments, and even the posture of the queen were all guided by tradition. The initiates were taught that hesitation or error was not merely human weakness, but a potential disruption of divine order, a concept that imbued each act of suffering with immense moral and psychological weight. One of the most haunting aspects of the initiation was the use of self-mutilation as a form of devotion. The queens pierced their tongues, ears, and fingertips, drawing blood that was collected for the gods. Obsidian blades, polished to razor sharpness, were used with precision to ensure that the act remained sacred rather than accidental. Every drop of blood was seen as a direct communication to the divine, a language more potent than words or prayers. The girls were trained to endure the pain without flinching, cultivating a mental detachment that allowed them to reconcile terror with transcendence. The psychological toll of this process cannot be overstated. It required the cultivation of a mindset capable of embracing suffering as not only inevitable, but holy. In addition to physical rituals, the initiation involved profound psychological trials. The girls were exposed to terrifying stories of previous queens, legends in which devotion and failure were starkly contrasted. Tales of pain endured, of cosmic catastrophes averted through sacrifice, were recited in dim candlelight, embedding both awe and fear into the psyche of the initiate. These stories functioned as both warning and inspiration, ensuring that the young queens internalized their role as guardians of divine will. The boundary between myth and personal experience blurred, as each act of ritual pain mirrored the heroic and horrific deeds of their predecessors. The ceremonial garments of the queens played a symbolic role in the initiation, further heightening the psychological impact. Elaborate headdresses adorned with feathers, jade, and gold were placed upon their heads, marking them as sacred beings while simultaneously constraining them within their roles. Robes embroidered with depictions of gods and celestial phenomena draped their bodies, a constant reminder of the power they embodied and the suffering they must endure. The garments were simultaneously a crown of honor and a shackle of expectation, visually representing the paradox of the Blood Queen's existence. Revered yet bound, beautiful yet tormented. The initiation was also a performance for the city's elite, though often hidden from common eyes. Kings and high priests observed discreetly, ensuring that the ritual was conducted flawlessly. Their presence added an additional layer of psychological pressure. The girls understood that their actions were not only offerings to the gods, but proofs of loyalty and obedience to human authorities as well. Success meant reverence and elevation. Failure meant shame, ostracism, or death. The stakes were incomprehensibly high, blending cosmic, social, and personal consequences into a single, intense experience that shaped the queen's understanding of power, devotion, and fear. Perhaps most haunting of all were the psychological techniques used to instill resilience. The girls were isolated, sometimes for days, in darkness or in chambers echoing with the chants of priests. Sensory deprivation, ritualized meditation, and exposure to symbolic depictions of death and cosmic catastrophe forced the initiate to confront mortality and suffering directly. The mind was trained as rigorously as the body, developing a capacity to endure pain without panic, to dissociate fear from action, and to embrace their suffering as a sacred duty. By the end of the initiation, the young queen had undergone a transformation that was as much psychological as it was physical, a rebirth into a role where terror and divinity were inseparable. The final stage of initiation often involved acts that were both deeply symbolic and profoundly taboo. Queens were required to enact rituals that symbolized the fertility of the land, the sustenance of the people, and the appeasement of gods whose demands were inscrutable. These acts, often shrouded in secrecy, blended sexuality, ritual, and pain, demonstrating the extent to which the queen's bodies were viewed as sacred vessels. The psychological complexity of performing such acts, simultaneously revered, feared, and condemned, forged a mindset that balanced obedience with detachment, awe with terror, and devotion with moral ambiguity. By the conclusion of initiation, the girl had been transformed into a blood queen, a figure both terrifying and exalted, a living conduit between mortal and divine. The process left no part of her untouched. Her body bore the marks of ritual, her mind bore the weight of responsibility, and her soul carried the paradox of devotion and horror. She emerged into public life, adorned in sacred garments, celebrated for her beauty and sanctity. Yet inwardly, she was forever changed by the intensity of her initiation. This transformation was the foundation of everything that would follow, a life defined by ritual, sacrifice, and the relentless demand of gods who knew no mercy. In understanding this initiation, one begins to grasp the full psychological complexity of the Blood Queens. They were not passive victims. They were participants in a cosmic drama where their suffering was simultaneously a gift, a responsibility, and a source of power. They learned to navigate the impossible, balancing devotion and dread, beauty and brutality, life and the ever-present shadow of death. The initiation was the crucible that forged this resilience, a passage through which they entered a world where faith demanded terror, and terror demanded faith. The story of the Blood Queens begins here, in the chambers of initiation, where beauty and pain converge, where mythology becomes lived experience, and where human endurance is tested against the impossible demands of gods. It is a story that forces us to confront the extremes of devotion, the intersection of horror and sanctity, and the dark intricacies of a civilization that demanded everything from its chosen women, and in return, offered a fleeting glimpse of immortality through sacrifice. In the shadowed inner chambers of Mayan temples, the Blood Queens performed acts that defy modern comprehension. These rituals, whispered about in codices and hinted at in archaeological remains, blended devotion with acts that were unspeakable to outsiders. For the queens, these ceremonies were both duty and curse, a terrifying paradox in which their bodies became instruments of divine will. The line between reverence and violation blurred as the sacred demanded acts that challenged not only societal norms, but the very limits of human endurance and morality. Every motion, every gesture, every drop of blood was an offering, a language through which the gods communicated their desires, their power, and their judgment. The taboo acts demanded of the queens were not random cruelty. Each ritual had purpose, grounded in theology, cosmology, and the intricate mythology of the Maya. Sexualized ceremonies were often intended to invoke fertility, sustain the cycles of agriculture, or ensure the prosperity of the city-state. Yet the queens were aware that these acts were simultaneously political, reinforcing the authority of kings and priests, while psychological, shaping their understanding of power, submission, and sacred obligation. The human mind was required to navigate the impossible, to perform acts that inspired horror while maintaining devotion and a sense of divine purpose. Evidence from codices and temple murals hints at the extremes of these rituals. Queens might be required to offer symbolic bodily fluids, enact sacred couplings with ritual partners, or perform acts that were coded in myth but terrifyingly real in practice. The ceremonies often involved layers of symbolism, Gestures, costumes, and chant combined to transform the act from mere physicality into a cosmic negotiation. The queens internalized this, understanding that their suffering, their exposure, and their participation were the vessels through which the gods could exert influence over the human world. It was a burden that demanded absolute obedience, and the psychological toll was profound. Pain and pleasure became intertwined in these rituals, a duality that forced the queens to exist in a liminal space between reverence and revulsion. The physical experience of the body was inseparable from the spiritual demands of the act. Obsidian blades, ceremonial knives, and intricate instruments of bloodletting were used alongside symbolic objects, feathers, and sacred garb, creating a ritual theater in which every detail mattered. Queens learned to dissociate, to treat their bodies as tools rather than as vessels of individual desire, and in this dissociation lay both survival and transcendence. They became both spectators and participants in a sacred drama whose scale and intensity defy comprehension. The secrecy surrounding these ceremonies added to their psychological weight. Even within the temple complex, only priests and select nobles might witness the acts. The queens were aware that their performance was a sacred spectacle, judged not by human eyes alone, but by the omnipresent gaze of the divine. Failure, hesitation, or misstep was unthinkable. To falter was to risk divine wrath not just on themselves, but on their people and city. The stakes transformed every gesture into an act of profound responsibility, imbuing horror with meaning, fear with purpose. It was a theater of devotion in which every movement carried consequences that were cosmic as well as personal. The psychological conditioning of the Blood Queens was remarkable. From a young age, they were taught that acts now considered taboo were sacred. What might be seen as moral transgression was reframed as divine communication. The queens internalized these acts, learning to reconcile societal disgust with religious imperative, fear with faith. This delicate balancing act created a form of mental resilience, allowing them to endure not only physical challenges, but the moral and existential weight of their responsibilities. Each ritual was an exercise in mastery over body and mind, a meditation in horror transformed into devotion. Yet even within these acts, there was beauty in symbolism, in ritual design, in the interplay of human form and divine expectation. The ceremonies were meticulously choreographed. Garments, gestures, chants, and instruments combined to create a visual and spiritual harmony that reflected the gods' perceived order. The juxtaposition of sensuality and sanctity, pain and purpose, horror and reverence created an aesthetic experience that elevated the queen's suffering into a sacred performance. The human mind, capable of processing such contrasts, was both tortured and inspired, forced to grapple with a reality where devotion required acts no one could easily witness or understand. The social consequences of these rituals were profound. While the queens performed acts invisible to the general populace, the results were publicly celebrated. Fertility of the land, successful harvests, and military victories were attributed to their devotion, reinforcing the notion that these horrors were necessary and sacred. Their acts legitimized political authority and maintained societal cohesion, demonstrating the duality of power and suffering. The queens existed in a paradoxical space, adored as divine intermediaries, feared for their proximity to the gods, and constrained by acts that denied their personal autonomy. Their lives were defined not by freedom, but by the intensity of devotion and obedience. The rituals also reveal the complex psychology of fear, control, and consent within the Maya elite. Queens had agency within the confines of their sacred duty, understanding the mechanisms through which their acts influence political, social, and cosmic outcomes. Yet they were constrained by the omnipresent authority of priests and kings, and by the unyielding demands of the gods. The tension between autonomy and obligation, pleasure and pain, fear and awe, defined their existence. In this space, horror became a form of empowerment, and devotion became an instrument of survival, a testament to the extremes of human adaptation under ritualized religious pressure. By participating in these taboo acts, the queens became symbols, simultaneously horrifying and sacred, of a human capacity to endure, to sacrifice, and to navigate the impossible intersections of morality, divinity, and survival. Their experiences, though hidden from history for centuries, illuminate the depths of belief and the extraordinary psychological resilience required to fulfill sacred duties. These rituals were not mere cruelty, but a carefully constructed system in which horror, devotion, and symbolism converged to create a social and spiritual order that demanded the utmost from its chosen vessels. In understanding the queen's participation in taboo acts, one begins to grasp the terrifying precision of Mayan religion, a civilization that demanded absolute fidelity to ritual, yet offered transcendence and power through obedience. The queen's bodies were instruments, their minds laboratories of devotion, and their lives exemplars of the extreme demands faith could impose. Here, in these secret chambers, the interplay of pain, pleasure, fear, and faith created a reality that challenges the imagination, leaving modern observers both horrified and fascinated. The story of the Blood Queens is not just about what they endured, but why they endured it. The taboo acts they performed were the language of gods, the currency of cosmic favor, and the linchpin of civilization itself. To witness the shadow of these rituals, even through historical reconstruction, is to confront a world where devotion demanded the unimaginable, and where horror was transformed into a sacred duty. It is here, in the hidden chambers of sacrifice and ritual, that the Blood Queens reveal the complex, terrifying, and awe-inspiring depths of human belief. The Blood Queens were more than instruments of ritual. They were pawns and players in a complex game of political and cosmic power. From the moment a girl was chosen for her sacred duty, she was thrust into a world where her body was both a tool of devotion and a symbol of authority. Kings relied on her to legitimize their rule. Priests depended on her to maintain cosmic balance, and the people revered her as a living link between mortals and gods. Yet beneath this reverence lay a harsh reality. The queens were constrained, their autonomy curtailed, and their lives dictated by forces far larger than themselves. Their power was real, yet paradoxical, an authority that existed only because they submitted, and a freedom that came only through obedience. The political function of the Blood Queens was inseparable from their sacred duties. By participating in rituals that ensured fertility, rainfall, and divine favor, they reinforced the legitimacy of the ruling elite. King's authority was framed as sanctioned by the gods, with the queen's devotion as proof. Without their compliance, ceremonies would falter, and with them, the perceived stability of the state. The queens were both sacred guarantors and political tools, and their actions maintained a delicate equilibrium between power, fear, and devotion. Their bodies became symbols of statecraft, a living affirmation that the divine and human hierarchies were intertwined. This duality of power and submission created a unique psychological landscape for the queens. On one hand, they wielded immense influence. The well-being of their city, the favor of the gods, and the fortunes of their rulers rested upon them. On the other hand, every gesture, every act, and every ritual was meticulously scrutinized. Their obedience had to be flawless, their devotion unwavering. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, could be interpreted as disloyalty to the gods and the king alike. The psychological tension of this existence, adored yet constrained, powerful yet imprisoned, shaped the minds of the queens in ways that demanded extraordinary resilience and adaptability. The queen's influence extended beyond politics into the very heart of the Maya cosmology. They were living intermediaries, channels through which divine energy flowed into the mortal world. The belief was that the gods themselves depended on their sacrifices, that the city's survival hinged on the queen's ability to endure ritual pain and enact taboo ceremonies. This connection between human action and cosmic consequence created a framework in which suffering was not merely tolerated. It was revered. The queens became both sacred and terrifying, figures whose actions could alter the fate of entire populations. Power, however, was never purely liberating. It was circumscribed by obligation and fear. While the queens could influence political and divine outcomes, their authority was contingent on compliance with ritual law. They could not act entirely on their own desires. Every choice was filtered through the lens of cosmic duty. Their autonomy was paradoxical. They were elevated above ordinary women in status, yet confined by expectations so extreme that ordinary freedoms were inconceivable. The constant negotiation between power and obligation became central to their psychological existence, shaping their understanding of agency, morality, and devotion. The ceremonial spaces themselves reflected this duality of power and submission. Altars, steps, and chambers were designed not just for ritual function, but to reinforce hierarchy. A queen standing at the apex of a pyramid symbolized her elevated status, yet she was literally elevated above her own autonomy, isolated in a position that magnified both reverence and vulnerability. The spatial arrangement of these sacred sites mirrored the queen's social and cosmic positions, central to divine and political order, yet perpetually under scrutiny and control. Every gesture performed on these platforms had amplified significance, turning ritual into spectacle, devotion into political instrument, and suffering into affirmation of both divine and earthly authority. The queen's bodies became repositories of cultural and political memory. Each wound, scar, or mark from ritualized bloodletting was a testament to their devotion and endurance. These physical markers served as silent proof of their fidelity to gods and rulers alike, transforming their suffering into a form of power. The very act of bearing visible or invisible traces of ritual trauma reinforced their authority, creating a paradoxical empowerment rooted in endurance, resilience, and submission. Through this lens, their pain was not merely endured. It was performed, displayed, and interpreted as a manifestation of sacred and political potency. Yet the human cost was immense. The queens endured acts that most could not imagine, both physically and psychologically. Their lives were an intricate balancing act between devotion, survival, and influence. They were symbols of divine favor, yet their existence was fraught with fear and restraint. The psychological endurance required to navigate these roles was extraordinary, demanding the ability to reconcile awe, terror, desire, and obedience into a coherent identity. Their power existed only because it was conditional, a fragile combination of sacred legitimacy and human endurance. Even as instruments of political and cosmic control, the queens retained subtle forms of agency. They could influence outcomes, offer counsel to rulers, and navigate the social dynamics of the court. Within the rigid structure of ritual and obligation, there were moments where their choices carried weight, shaping ceremonies, interpreting omens, or determining the timing of acts critical to both spiritual and political agendas. This limited autonomy, while constrained by overarching demands, allowed the queens to engage with their sacred role not just as victims of circumstance, but as active participants in a world where devotion and authority were inseparable. The duality of the queen's existence, powerful yet constrained, revered yet exploited, exemplifies the complex interplay between human agency and divine obligation in Maya civilization. Their lives illuminate how societies can simultaneously elevate and oppress, how devotion can confer influence while demanding extreme sacrifice. In understanding the political and cosmic significance of the Blood Queens, we gain insight not only into the rituals they performed, but into the very structure of Maya society, a civilization in which fear, reverence, and duty were inseparably intertwined, and where the human body could be both a weapon of power and a conduit of divine will. Ultimately, the Blood Queens occupied a space that was at once terrifying and exalted. Their influence was undeniable, their suffering profound, and their role central to the survival of both state and faith. They remind us that power, when entwined with devotion and fear, is never simple. It is a living paradox, demanding obedience, endurance, and courage beyond comprehension. The Queen's lives, suspended between reverence and terror, reveal the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go when faced with the intertwined demands of faith, politics, and cosmic survival. The life of a Mayan Blood Queen was defined not only by what she did, but by what she dared not refuse. In the sacred chambers, where light flickered over obsidian knives and painted altars, hesitation could mean death, not only for herself, but potentially for the city she served. To fail in ritual observance was considered a direct affront to the gods, a breach that could summon drought, famine, or plague. The stakes were absolute. Obedience was not optional. It was the difference between survival and catastrophe. The Queens understood that their devotion had tangible consequences, and the constant pressure forged a psychological landscape steeped in fear, awe, and moral ambiguity. Refusal or failure was met with horrifying repercussions. Historical accounts, codices, and temple inscriptions suggest that queens who faltered could be exiled, publicly shamed, or even executed in ritualized ceremonies that mirrored the very acts they were supposed to perform. The punishments were meticulously designed to reinforce obedience, instill terror, and remind all who observed that divine law was absolute. One misstep was a moral and cosmic failure, capable of undermining not only personal honor, but the stability of the city-state itself. The psychological weight of this possibility hung over the Queens like a constant shadow, a presence that ensured even private doubt was tempered by fear. In some accounts, failure could take the form of physical punishment within the temple itself. Queens were sometimes restrained, subjected to symbolic acts of humiliation, or forced to witness the ritualized suffering of others as a warning. These acts were designed not to destroy the individual entirely, but to recalibrate their understanding of duty, reinforcing the notion that obedience and pain were inseparable. The ceremonies underscored the delicate balance of devotion. A queen could wield influence and command reverence, yet she was never free from the consequences of failing to meet divine expectations. The terror was both psychological and performative, a constant reminder of the stakes embedded in sacred service. The consequences extended beyond physical punishment. Queens who faltered risked permanent social and spiritual disgrace. Their actions were not only monitored by priests and kings, but scrutinized by the collective consciousness of the city. Rumors, whispers, and tales of failure could tarnish their legacy, erasing years of devotion from history in an instant. The psychological burden of this surveillance was immense. Every ritual, every gesture, every act of obedience was a negotiation between fear, faith, and the desire for survival. Even minor lapses could carry a weight disproportionate to their immediate effect, amplified by the belief that the gods themselves were watching, judging, and ready to punish. Isolation was often used as a tool to magnify this tension. Queens could be secluded in dark chambers for days, cut off from the comforting presence of allies, and subjected to rituals designed to induce reflection, anxiety, and obedience. In these periods, the mind became both crucible and prison, confronting fear and doubt while attempting to maintain devotion. The queens had to internalize that their suffering, endurance, and obedience were not just personal acts but cosmic imperatives. The constant negotiation between fear, faith, and duty shaped a unique psychological resilience, an ability to endure horror as sacred obligation, to convert terror into devotion, and to maintain composure under the gaze of both gods and society. Refusal, therefore, was not a simple act of rebellion. It was an existential choice with repercussions reaching far beyond the individual. By defying ritual expectation, a queen risked unleashing disaster upon her people, fracturing the delicate cosmic and social order that she was sworn to uphold. In this sense, every act of obedience, no matter how horrifying, was also an act of protection of the city, its rulers, and the delicate balance between mortal and divine. The psychological complexity of this realization cannot be overstated. Fear was never arbitrary. It was inseparable from responsibility, devotion, and cosmic consequence. Even acts of defiance were carefully calibrated. Queens might push boundaries subtly, navigating rituals with precision to assert personal agency without triggering disaster. Yet the consequences of miscalculation were stark. The punishments were as symbolic as they were physical, emphasizing that sacred duty could not be circumvented. In extreme cases, defiance could result in ritualized death, a ceremonial execution performed with such precision and reverence that the queen's final act became both a warning and a continuation of sacred duty. In this context, even death was framed as devotion, a testament to the all-encompassing power of religious obligation. The fear of refusal also had a profound effect on the queen's psychological development. Living under the constant threat of divine and societal punishment required extraordinary mental discipline. They cultivated resilience, detachment, and the ability to dissociate pain from meaning, integrating suffering into the fabric of their identity. Their lives were a constant exercise in managing terror, converting it into focus, and embracing obligation as both survival strategy and spiritual necessity. In many ways, the queen's endurance transformed fear into power. Their obedience commanded awe, their suffering legitimized rulers, and their devotion maintained cosmic and social order. Public spectacle amplified the psychological stakes. The consequences of refusal were often enacted within ceremonial spaces where priests, nobles, and sometimes even common citizens could observe. This created an environment where obedience was both private and performative, reinforcing social hierarchies and reminding all participants of the immutable power of divine law. The queen's suffering, fear, and resilience became intertwined with the political and spiritual life of the city, cementing their role as both sacred intermediaries and exemplars of obedience. Yet, paradoxically, the very pressures that could destroy the queen's autonomy also elevated their status. By navigating extreme fear, performing taboo rituals, and surviving the ever-present threat of punishment, the Blood Queens demonstrated extraordinary psychological and spiritual strength. They became living embodiments of divine will and human endurance, revered not only for their beauty or status, but for their ability to balance horror, devotion, and cosmic responsibility. Their suffering was simultaneously a weapon, a tool of legitimacy, and a testament to the extraordinary demands of their sacred role. The consequences of refusal, then, illuminate the terrifying rigor of Mayan civilization. The queen's obedience was enforced through a complex interplay of physical, psychological, social, and cosmic pressures. To refuse was to risk punishment, disgrace, or death. To comply was to endure acts that defied human comprehension. In this environment, fear was not arbitrary, but a deliberate mechanism of control and devotion, shaping not only the actions of the queens, but the very structure of Maya society. It is in this crucible of obligation, terror, and endurance that the Blood Queen's extraordinary psychological resilience was forged. Ultimately, the story of refusal and its consequences reveals the profound moral and existential stakes of serving as a Blood Queen. Their lives were defined by a constant negotiation between fear and faith, agency and obligation, survival and devotion. By examining the consequences of defiance, we begin to understand the extraordinary pressures under which these women lived, the psychological mastery required to navigate a world in which the gods, society, and their own bodies demanded absolute obedience, and the terrifying reality that their devotion was inseparable from suffering. The myths that surrounded the Blood Queens were as intricate and terrifying as the rituals they performed. These women were not only servants of the gods. They were living embodiments of ancient legends, characters in a story written in blood, fire, and celestial alignment. The Maya did not merely tell stories of devotion. They performed them, enacted them, and lived them. Every ritual the queens performed was an echo of myth. Every drop of blood, a reenactment of divine struggle. To understand the full depth of their experience, one must enter a world where gods and mortals share a stage, where terror and devotion are inseparable, and where human psychology is tested against the demands of the sacred. Central to these myths were the gods themselves, beings of immense power, beauty, and cruelty. Rain, sun, fertility, and death were all personified, their personalities capricious, their demands absolute. The queens were expected to embody the duality of these deities, nurturing yet terrifying, beautiful yet horrifying, submissive yet commanding. In myth, the gods themselves endured suffering, and the queens were expected to mirror this pain as a form of devotion. By inflicting suffering upon themselves, they aligned their mortal existence with divine experience, creating a psychological and spiritual connection that reinforced both their sacred authority and their subjugation. The legend spoke of cosmic balance, where failure could lead to catastrophe. Just as the gods faced trials, so too did mortals who served them. The Blood Queens became living symbols of this mythology, their rituals mirroring celestial events and divine acts. Each ceremony, whether involving bloodletting, taboo acts, or complex gestures, was laden with symbolic meaning. Their lives were a continuous reenactment of myth, where the boundary between reality and legend blurred. In performing these acts, the queens did not merely obey. They became active participants in the cosmic drama, their suffering transforming into a narrative that shaped the fate of their people and the world they inhabited. Psychologically, this connection to myth created a complex interplay of fear, awe, and identity. The queens were trained to see themselves not as ordinary humans, but as vessels of divine will. Pain, humiliation, and taboo acts were reframed as sacred communication, and every ritual became a test of both faith and mental endurance. They internalized the stories of gods and ancestors, allowing these myths to guide their actions, shape their self-perception, and justify acts that would otherwise be morally incomprehensible. In this way, mythology became both a tool of empowerment and a mechanism of control, intertwining belief, obedience, and psychological resilience. The most sacred myths often involved acts that mirrored the queen's rituals. Bloodletting, sexualized ceremonies, and other taboo practices were depicted in temple murals and codices as essential to maintaining cosmic order. Each act was highly codified, its meaning layered and multifaceted, a physical offering, a symbolic reenactment, and a psychological testament to faith. The queen's participation was both literal and metaphorical. Their bodies became the medium through which myth was enacted, their suffering the bridge connecting human and divine realms. In essence, the queen's lives were a living theater of mythology, where every action resonated with cosmic significance. Legends also emphasized the extremes of devotion. Stories described queens who endured unimaginable pain or committed acts that were both horrifying and sacred, highlighting the moral and psychological stakes of their service. These narratives served multiple purposes. They inspired awe, instilled fear, and legitimized the extraordinary demands placed upon these women. By embedding the queen's experiences within myth, the Maya created a cultural framework in which devotion was inseparable from suffering and horror was framed as holiness. The psychological conditioning inherent in these stories prepared queens to navigate the paradox of being both revered and tormented, both empowered and enslaved. The sacred psychology of the Blood Queens was further amplified by the interplay of public and private myth. While the city celebrated their divinity, few could glimpse the private horror of the rituals themselves. This duality reinforced the queen's understanding of their roles as both objects of veneration and instruments of divine will. Publicly, they embodied celestial grace. Privately, they endured acts that demanded mental, emotional, and physical fortitude. The tension between public reverence and private torment created a psychological crucible, forging a mindset capable of reconciling horror with holiness, terror with devotion, and duty with survival. In this way, the myths surrounding the Blood Queens were not passive stories, but active frameworks shaping behavior, identity, and perception. The queens learned to navigate moral ambiguity, transforming fear into obedience and pain into purpose. They became psychological acrobats, balancing the demands of gods, rulers, and their own human instincts, all while performing acts that demanded the utmost precision and emotional control. Through myth, the queens internalized the extremes of devotion, the inevitability of suffering, and the transcendence achievable through obedience, creating a complex interplay of horror and awe that defined their entire existence. The aesthetic dimension of myth also played a crucial role. Temple murals, ceremonial attire, and ritual instruments all depicted sacred narratives in vivid detail, reinforcing the queen's connection to cosmic stories. Colors, patterns, and symbols were meticulously chosen to mirror celestial events, God's characteristics, and moral lessons. Each gesture during a ritual resonated with these visual cues, transforming the queen's performance into a living representation of mythology. Observers, priests, rulers, and the public interpreted these acts through the lens of legend, reinforcing social hierarchies and the perceived necessity of the queen's extreme devotion. Yet the psychological impact of myth was not limited to empowerment. The narratives also imposed tremendous pressure, reinforcing fear of failure and underscoring the consequences of disobedience. The queens were constantly reminded that their actions had cosmic significance, that mistakes could bring disaster, and that their suffering was a moral and spiritual imperative. This duality, myth as both guide and enforcer, created a mental environment in which devotion, fear, and identity were inextricably linked. The queens became both authors and subjects of their own mythic existence, their lives an ongoing dialogue with divine narrative. In understanding these legends, one begins to grasp why the queens' lives were simultaneously horrifying and awe-inspiring. They were not merely performing rituals. They were living myth, enacting cosmic narratives that intertwined fear, devotion, and survival. The gods' cruelty, the city's dependence, and the personal sacrifices of the queens converged to create a reality where horror was sanctified and devotion required endurance beyond comprehension. The psychological depth of this existence reveals the extraordinary resilience, intelligence, and adaptability of the queens, who navigated a world in which the sacred demanded acts most would consider unthinkable. Ultimately, the myths surrounding the Blood Queens illuminate the intersection of psychology, theology, and human endurance. They show us how belief can shape perception, how ritual can transform suffering into devotion, and how horror can become a vehicle for spiritual power. The queen's lives were a continuous enactment of these narratives, their bodies and minds conduits for stories that span generations. By examining the legends alongside the rituals, we see the intricate ways in which fear, awe, and psychological resilience were cultivated, creating figures whose lives challenge our understanding of devotion, sacrifice, and the extraordinary capacities of the human mind. The story of the Blood Queens, as told through myth, is a testament to the extremes of faith, the power of narrative, and the terrifying beauty of devotion. It is in these legends, replete with horror, symbolism, and cosmic consequence, that we encounter the full psychological and spiritual magnitude of their existence. They were not passive participants in history. They were living embodiments of myth, forced to endure acts that tested the limits of human endurance. And through their suffering, they became immortalized as sacred intermediaries, bridging the mortal and divine realms with every act of devotion, every ritualized gesture, and every drop of blood. The life of a Blood Queen was a relentless negotiation between devotion and horror. By adulthood, she had endured decades of rituals, ceremonies, and acts that tested every aspect of her being, physical, moral, and psychological. Yet from this crucible emerged a figure both terrifying and sacred, a human embodiment of divine will whose existence held the fate of her people in balance. The cruelty she endured was never mere punishment. It was sanctified, an integral part of cosmic necessity, elevated to a form of horrifying reverence. Every ritual imposed extreme psychological and emotional strain. Pain, humiliation, and taboo acts were reframed as sacred offerings, acts that ensured divine favor and the city's survival. The queens internalized fear as guidance, obedience as power, and suffering as purpose. Their resilience transformed terror into devotion, horror into holiness, and cruelty into a structured, almost aesthetic, form of sacred duty. Rituals became complex performances of cruelty and sanctity. The queens reenacted myths, performed bloodletting, and enacted taboo ceremonies that mirrored the cosmic struggles of the gods. Every gesture carried profound symbolic meaning, linking mortal action to divine consequence. Observers interpreted these acts as affirmations of sacred and political order. The queens were simultaneously objects of awe and instruments of obedience, blending horror and holiness into a living spectacle. The moral complexity of their lives was staggering. Revered as divine intermediaries, they engaged in acts of profound personal violation. The tension between sacred duty and human instinct required extraordinary psychological mastery. The interplay of beauty and terror, devotion and fear, sacred and profane, defined their existence. Temple chambers and ceremonial garments juxtaposed splendor with suffering, creating a visual and spiritual tension that amplified awe and fear. Their suffering was both private and public. It validated rulers and priests, reinforced social hierarchies, and communicated divine law to the populace. Psychological resilience was essential. They dissociated, converted fear into focus, and endured suffering while maintaining grace and authority. At the height of their service, the queens embodied the paradox of cruelty as sanctity, enduring horrors that validated cosmic and political order. In this crucible of obedience, the queens' lives became lessons in endurance, morality, and the extraordinary capacities of human belief. Horror became meaningful, pain became purpose, and suffering transformed into reverence. The Blood Queens forced a confrontation with the unsettling truth that cruelty, when sanctified, can inspire awe and command obedience. Their existence reveals the terrifying yet extraordinary capacity of the human psyche to navigate extremes of morality, devotion, and fear, transforming suffering into sacred purpose. The legacy of the Blood Queens stretches far beyond the walls of the temples in which they performed their rituals. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of their lives resonate, revealing not only the extremes of devotion and cruelty, but also the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to endure, adapt, and find meaning in suffering. They remain enigmatic figures, at once terrifying and awe-inspiring, their stories preserved in codices, temple murals, and oral histories that hint at the terrifying and sacred acts that define their existence. To understand the Blood Queens is to confront the very limits of human experience, to peer into a world where devotion demanded the unimaginable, and where the sacred and horrifying were inseparably intertwined. In reflecting on their lives, one is struck by the paradoxical nature of their existence. These women were at once revered and constrained, empowered and oppressed. Their bodies were instruments of divine will, their actions scrutinized by gods, priests, rulers, and society at large. Yet, within this intense framework of obligation and fear, they cultivated extraordinary psychological resilience, mastering pain, fear, and moral ambiguity with a precision few could comprehend. They existed in a realm where suffering was sanctified, where horror became purpose, and where the act of enduring transformed them into living conduits of cosmic order. The societal and cosmic significance of the Blood Queen's sacrifices cannot be overstated. By performing taboo acts, enduring excruciating rituals, and maintaining unwavering devotion, they ensured the stability of the city-state, the favor of the gods, and the continuation of essential cycles of life, death, and renewal. Their suffering became a mechanism through which political and spiritual authority was legitimized, reinforcing social hierarchies and maintaining the delicate balance between mortal ambition and divine expectation. In this sense, their lives were not merely personal narratives, but instruments of civilization itself, intertwining human endurance with the very fabric of cultural continuity. Yet the psychological and moral complexities of their existence provide a haunting mirror for modern audiences. In witnessing the extremes demanded of the queens, we are confronted with the unsettling truth that human beings can be conditioned to endure acts that defy ordinary comprehension. That devotion can transform suffering into a tool of both empowerment and subjugation. The Queen's experiences remind us that fear, obedience, and ritualized cruelty are not merely relics of a distant past, but are deeply rooted in human psychology, capable of shaping identity, behavior, and belief in ways that transcend time. The Queen's legacy is also one of paradoxical beauty. While their lives were marked by terror, their rituals were steeped in symbolism, artistry, and cosmic significance. Murals, garments, and ceremonial instruments captured the interplay of horror and divinity, creating a visual and spiritual narrative that elevated suffering into sacred art. The Queen's endurance became not only a testament to their personal resilience, but also a living performance that communicated devotion, legitimized authority, and reinforced the myths that defined their civilization. In this way, cruelty was transmuted into purpose, and suffering was transformed into a medium of profound cultural and spiritual expression. Modern reflection on the Blood Queens forces a confrontation with morality, power, and devotion. Their lives challenge contemporary notions of agency, ethics, and the limits of endurance. They lived in a world where fear was not arbitrary, but a structured mechanism to enforce obedience and sustain cosmic balance. Their suffering was simultaneously a personal trial, a public spectacle, and a sacred act that connected mortal life to divine will. In analyzing these dynamics, we begin to understand the extraordinary psychological complexity of ritualized devotion and the ways in which human beings can reconcile terror, duty, and reverence into a coherent and meaningful existence. Moreover, the Blood Queen's story illuminates the broader human capacity for adaptation. Enduring repeated acts of terror and taboo, navigating moral ambiguity, and sustaining faith in the face of unimaginable pressure required not only physical endurance, but exceptional cognitive and emotional flexibility. Their lives exemplify the extraordinary potential of a human mind to integrate fear, suffering, and purpose, transforming even the most horrifying experiences into a structured framework of meaning and agency. In this, their legacy transcends history, offering insight into the timeless dynamics of belief, obedience, and human resilience. The echoes of their existence also invite reflection on the interplay of beauty and horror, devotion and cruelty. The rituals of the Blood Queens were simultaneously terrifying and sublime, structured yet chaotic, personal yet universal. They embodied the paradox that what terrifies us can also inspire awe, and that acts of devotion may demand choices beyond conventional morality. Their lives were performances of paradox, enduring suffering while shaping cosmic and societal outcomes, demonstrating that the boundaries between horror and holiness are often intertwined in ways that defy simple understanding. Finally, the story of the Blood Queens serves as a meditation on legacy, memory, and the human fascination with the forbidden. Their acts, though hidden from the common gaze, were preserved through art, myth, and historical record, ensuring that the terror, devotion, and resilience they embodied would not be forgotten. In studying them, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, our capacity for endurance, our attraction to extremes, and our ability to sanctify suffering in the pursuit of meaning. The Blood Queens remain enduring symbols of these truths, their lives offering a dark, mesmerizing window into the interplay of devotion, cruelty, and human resilience. In conclusion, the Blood Queens' lives are a testament to the extraordinary demands of faith, the complexities of power, and the terrifying beauty of human endurance. They illuminate the ways in which suffering can be sanctified, fear transformed into devotion, and cruelty elevated into a mechanism of both cosmic and societal order. Their legacy challenges modern observers to confront the depths of human belief, the limits of psychological resilience, and the paradoxical interplay of horror and awe. In their endurance, they leave us with a haunting insight that the human mind and spirit are capable of navigating extremes that defy comprehension, and that devotion, no matter how horrifying, can shape the course of history, culture, and the very understanding of what it means to be human. The story of the Blood Queens lingers long after the rituals have ended, etched into the ruins of temples, the faded pigments of murals, and the pages of codices that survive. It is a story that challenges, fascinates, and terrifies, reminding us that the past was a place where devotion demanded the unimaginable, where cruelty and sanctity coexisted, and where the human capacity for endurance was pushed to its absolute limits. Their lives leave a legacy not only of fear and reverence, but of profound reflection, a testament to the haunting power of history and the enduring mystery of human devotion.